Welcome to session 4. I'm going to turn it over to Will, and he's going to talk about custom reports and racking. Thanks, Will.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody. We're now on session 4 of day 2, which means section 7 of the total conference. So thank you for hanging in there. In this last section, we're going to cover addressing with racking, and then we're also going to cover custom reports. Without further ado, here we go. Part 2, addressing with racks. As I explained in the previous section, you can also address without racks. So if you're going to address with racks, you got to get something. The first thing we're going to talk about is what do you get by addressing with racks? Then we'll walk through some of the mechanics of how to do it. You'll get to define your own racks, and we'll walk through some real-world solutions just like we did for the addressing, and we'll finish off with some links for advanced topics. So what do you get? Well, you can address without racks. You can use Visio or Excel. I've seen some beautiful rack diagrams that people have created in Excel, NVIDIA, and in Visio. So what do you get by using racks in the software? Well, the first thing, I guess, is kind of obvious. You don't have to use Visio or Excel to create your rack diagrams. You get your rack diagrams automatically. Why that's important is that if you change your show, there's no chance of having an inconsistency between the show that you've changed, how it's addressed and so forth, and the rack layout that you've done. They're bound together in the software, so you're guaranteed to get consistency. Finally, when you take into consideration racks while addressing the show, you can optimize in an automated way for things like chains wrapping off the end of racks, or cross-loading chains perfectly, or binding modules to pods or modules to single-shot racks, or being able to count the right number of single-shot racks that you need for the different configurations that you have, or being able to assign firing system addresses in a way that reduces the number of racks that are required, which can be the case if your single-shot racks have various constraints like angle constraints or a limited number of tubes of varying sizes that can fit in a particular row, like the Pyrolamus racks. So when you use the software to assign addressing with racks, the software is able to make optimizations that would actually be quite difficult for a human being to keep in his head to figure out how to do. Let's jump into an example. Just like before with addressing, we're going to need to have a show to work with. So I'm going to start off by removing all of the positions except for one, because for talking about racks and addressing, we can just do everything within one position. Then I'll add some effects. I'm just going to add a 3-inch chrysanthemum, and I'll duplicate it a few times, 16, 32, 64 times, and put it into a sequence. So there is our show that we're going to use for the first few examples of doing addressing and racking together. I'd like you to get a gist for how it works first before diving into the details. So we just created a show. Now we will add racks for the show by using the menu item, Add Racks for Show. And this menu item will choose from the racks that are available in my effects list or inventory over here, which is currently just showing the generic effects that include some generic racks that are provided, so you have something to get started with. A dialog pops up telling us what it's going to do. It says it will add 7 racks, 3-inch racks, and it will have 0 leftover devices after doing that, which is good news. And there they are. So we're looking now at a rack diagram with the 7 racks that function added to the show based on the racks that were available over here and based on the number of effects in the show. I had 64 of those 3-inch effects in the show, so it's not surprising that I would be getting these 3-inch racks. I think each of these 3-inch racks had 10 shells, so that's also making sense. 10 times 7 is 70, and we had 64 shots in the show, so we couldn't do it with any less than that. When we inserted those racks, it also put a label underneath, which is the type of rack that it inserted. I could change that name if I wanted to. Having added the racks, now when I address the show, it's going to take a extended view of what addressing means. Instead of just assigning firing system addresses, i.e. module and pin, to the effects, it's also going to assign tubes from the racks that you've already laid out to the effects. Here we go. Address show. We'll just address it for Cobra in kind of a standard way. And when we address the show, the same function that we were doing in the last section, in addition to filling out these rows over here, it also filled out the pins in the racks. What you're seeing in each tube is the pin number, and then below the rack you're seeing the module number. So this first rack on the left has pin numbers 1 through 10 of module 0. The next rack over has pin numbers 11 through 18. Cobra systems have 18 pins per module of module 0, and then it rolls over to module number 2. So you see pin number 1 and 2 in magenta for module number 1. Okay? Imagine that when we address the show, imagine that when we laid out the racks, that we laid out the racks for our show in clusters. Like, let's say that these 3 racks were over here, and these 4 racks were over here. You can see that addressing the show in the way that we've just done is a little bit of a problem, because module number 1, starting here with pin 1, wrapping around pin 3, 4, 5, down to pin number 12, continues over here with 13 through 18. So no matter where you put that module, whether you put it in the middle or on the left or on the right, you've got E-matches that are extending between these 2 pods of racks at a great distance. You might trip over them and so forth. So we can add a constraint like we did in the previous talk that prevents that kind of thing. Go to the addressing menu. We're adding a constraint on the module because we want the module to be restricted to not just a position. We're working all within a position, so we'll keep that position there. But now we want the module to be constrained to the rack cluster. And rack cluster is just the name we give to a group of racks that are snapped together in this view. So when I address the show with that constraint, let's go back and look. Module number 1 goes up to there, the first module, then module number 1, the second module, begins there, goes to 12, and here was the problem before. Previously, module number 1 was used over here, and now it's not. Now we begin with module number 2, starting afresh. We're leaving those extra 6 pins, pin number 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 of module number 1. We're leaving those pins unused because they can't stretch from this side to this side. Okay? So that's an example of addressing the show once racks have already been laid out. And it's an example of what you get by doing that. Having addressed the show, we can then go to diagrams, rack layout diagrams, and we can print out rack layout diagrams for the crew that include a picture telling them where to put the effects. Okay? Terrific. So you've now seen it, kind of the quick overview of adding racks for the show and then taking those racks into consideration. Now I'm going to walk through some of the mechanics that we glossed over in the overview section. You need to be able to create your own racks because at minimum, even your mortar racks have a specific number of mortars in them that might not be the same as somebody else's or our default ones. And if you have single shot racks, well, it's almost a sure thing that you have some special configurations of your single shot racks that are different from what other people have. So let's go in to creating our own racks. The racks are saved in your effect file. When we did the function that says add racks for show, that function uses racks that are in this collection over here. So we were looking at the generic effects, and if I filter this list to racks, you can see the generic effects had a dozen or so predefined racks, of which we used 7 of this particular rack for the show. That's because our show had 3-inch shells, so it looked through this list for a rack that was compatible with 3-inch shells. It found this rack and it inserted as many as required. There were 7 racks for 64 shells to rack the show. If you define your own racks, you'll probably put your own racks into My Effects or into your company inventory. So I'll delete the racks that I've previously defined, and we'll just define one new rack here so you get the idea. To define your own rack, go to Create Rack. There are different kinds of racks: mortar racks, various configurations of single shot racks, cake racks, and candle racks. You're all familiar with these. Each of these is customizable. The single shot racks are especially customizable. I'll walk through what some of the customizations are so you're aware of them, but I'm not going to get into the details of all of them because it's too much to cover. We're going to create a mortar rack, but instead of a simple mortar rack that has just one row of mortars, say, sandwiched between some 2x4s, we're going to create a rack that has 3 rows. Here they are, 1, 2, 3. And I'd like to put a, well, let's see. I'm going to make this rack have 3 rows of tubes, and it's going to be a multi-caliber rack. So we'll have, on the first row and the third row, we'll have 12 tubes of size 2-inch. And in the middle row, we'll have 10 tubes of size 3-inch. And I'm also going to tilt out the far left and the far right row of tubes. So we'll give this rack a name, rack 100. It's a part number. It's going to go into my inventory just like anything else. And create that rack. There it is. That's just like if I created an effect, except it's a rack. When looking at the rack layout view here, if I click on this button, it will insert one of these racks. Again, it's analogous to when I'm looking at the other view here. If I click on one of these icons, it will insert the effect. clicking on an icon inserts the item, whatever it is, whether it's an effect or a rack. So here I'll switch back. I've been using the keyboard shortcut Shift-2 and Shift-3 because it's a lot faster than the menu item to shift between the racks view and the effects view and the simulation view. So right now we are in the Shift-2 view that includes the 3 windows with the design window center. If I press Shift-3, I'm doing that now, it continues to show 3 windows, but on the left it shows the rack layout window, and on the right it automatically filters this list with the rack filter. So it's convenient for me. I want to look at my effects. That's where we added this rack, and click on it. There it is. So if you recall, when we defined this rack, we defined this rack to have 2 different calibers in it and different number of tubes, obviously. I could click on it multiple times to add multiple ones, and I can move them around. And if I want, I can edit pins here, and I can move around the pins from one rack to another. When I address the show, it assigned all these pin numbers and tube numbers, but that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. I can just as easily drag them around to wherever I want. Now watch what happens if I drag one of these 3-inch effects into one of the 2-inch tubes. It's red. The red is a warning. It tells me this is a 2-inch tube. You dragged a 3-inch effect into it. I think the angle is also wrong. So there are multiple reasons that this is showing up as a warning. It might be the case that you're doing that on purpose and that you choose to ignore the warning because you may be sleeving a smaller effect in a larger tube. But in general, when you see something that's red, that means take a look at it. That applies also to if I drag it off into the boonies and let go, like a rubber band that's snapped all the way down here, and it's red down here now because this is a pin whose effect does not have a tube assigned to it. I can click on it and drag it over, and it's no longer red down here once it has a tube assigned. So I can glance at this, and when at first glance, if I don't see any red, I know I'm in good shape. Analogous to moving the tubes around, or the pins in the tubes around that assignment by dragging and dropping, I can also drag around the pins on the module here. So I can move this effect to be shot by this module instead of this module. You can see I'm really making a mess of this because the black lines in the background are the wires. And you can see that now I've got wires going from this module all over the place. So if I was going to do this, I better have a good reason to do this. Back in the editing racks view, you've already seen that I can drag racks around. The little controls on the corners of this rack allow me to tilt it left and right, or pitch it forward back, or rotate it. When I tilt it to the right, you can see the angle at the top, up there. If I tilted this to 15 degrees to the right, what's going to happen? Well, all of the effects in it are going to turn red because those effects in the design of the show are straight up, but now my rack is tilted to the right. So it's a warning to me. That comes back to the point that I mentioned earlier. You could just as easily create, well, not just as easily, but you can create using Visio or other CAD software or even Excel, your own rack diagram. But you're never 100% sure that you haven't made a mistake. If you use the software to address the show and assign racks, then when you glance at the diagram and you don't see any red, it's reassuring to you that you aren't using any racks at angles that don't match the show or wrong effects, that kind of thing. We just created these mortar racks to our own specification. I'd like to introduce you to some of the other parameters that you can set for defining your own racks, although I'm not going to go in depth into explaining them. When we create a rack, in our example, we chose a mortar rack. If instead I chose one of these single shot racks, then I would be picking between different types of single shot racks that have different degrees of freedom. Some single shot racks have the angles of all of their tubes predefined. Either the rack is built that way, or you've chosen to configure your rack that way prior to designing the show, and you're treating it simply as if it is a fixed angle rack. Other single shot racks have tubes that can be individually adjusted to any angle. So from an addressing perspective, you can address any angle, or rather the software can address any angle to any tube, no problem. And you'll just go adjust the rack as necessary using the angles that it tells you. Other single shot racks have a degree of freedom, but not that much of a degree of freedom. They're made of rows, and the rows can be tilted, but when you tilt a row, it tilts all of the tubes in the row together. Other racks are similar, but instead of tilting the row on its side, each tube is adjustable, and it's only adjustable within the row sideways. Like if the row was your hand of fingers and you could fan out your fingers, pitching, adjusting the tubes would be fanning out your fingers. Lastly, there are two options here for single shot racks that have posts instead of slots, and the posts can have multiple tubes tied to them in one manner or another. When you pick one of these structures, that controls what angles are allowed to go into the tubes of the rack. Other factors for single shot racks, you are probably giving the impression correctly that single shot racks are quite complex. Some single shot racks, like Pyro-Llamas, can have multiple size tubes, but the row in the rack is only a certain number of millimeters long. So the number of tubes that you can fit in that row of the rack depends on what size you're using. So if you define the size of the length of the rack row here for your single shot rack, and you make this rack compatible with any size, then the addressing system will know that it can fill in tubes up until the point that the width, the outer diameter of those tubes gets to 400 millimeters, and then at that point, that row of tubes is filled up and it moves on to the next. This is an example where it's a little hard to calculate on your own as a human being how many racks you need with so many degrees of freedom, but the software is pretty good at keeping track of things like that. Lastly, there's a section here for pre-wired pins. Racks like the Pyro-Digit racks in Italy, or the Evolved racks in the UK, or the iShot racks, also racks made with iShot bases, also from Italy, have a notion that the rack is pre-wired. In other words, you don't have a choice with these racks what wire goes to what tube, because it's predefined. It's already built in, it's pre-wired, and that makes it easy to snap in, and for some of the hardware, the effects, because you don't have to wire the eMatch yourself. It's wired up in a reusable way. I guess in the Pyro-Digit case, it's not so much a case of being pre-wired as a case of having a strong expectation or a standard or a convention for how they're wired. From the software perspective, you can treat a strong expectation or convention just as the same thing as if it's a requirement. It can make it easier to set up the show if you always know that a certain tube corresponds to pin number 1 and another tube corresponds to pin number 2 and so forth. Then when when the crew is setting up the show, he doesn't have to wonder what wire goes to what tube. It's always the same. The software can figure that out once you define how the pins are pre-wired into the rack. Okay, so those are the esoterics of defining single-shot racks. Single-shot racks are complicated. The benefit to you is that once you define your racks, then the addressing system can optimize the addressing for your racks. I'm going to walk through just 3 real-world problems here for racks. I mentioned one at the beginning, avoid wires going between rack clusters. In fact, we covered that at the beginning. That was the first example we did. So we'll just do 2 more examples here. I mentioned avoiding chains spilling over racks, but we haven't done that one yet, so that's the first one that we'll do. And then the second one, we'll do an example of cross-loading chains where each shell of a chain is going into a different rack at a different angle instead of all of the shells of the chain going into a rack on the same rack. We're also going to need a show for this example. Give me a moment. Since we're dealing with chains, I'm going to create a 3-inch chain of 6. So 3-inch salute chain of 6 shells. And that's what I'm going to use for this example. And then, so that's 6 shells I just inserted, 6 salutes, all 3-inch. I'm going to duplicate that now, 2, 4, 8, 16 times, and spread it out. So this is going to look a little bit like a finale. And then to make the example a little bit more interesting, I'm also going to insert some 3-inch shells that are not chains. Okay, so here's my show. It's a 3-inch show with a bunch of shells. I'll randomize these. It's a bunch of 3-inch shells followed by a salute finale. In fact, while we're here, this is not unracking, but I want to show you one clever little thing. I'm going to advance the pace of the show leading up to the finale here by selecting all of these shells that are spaced out a second each. And then go to the script menu and do time adjustments and speed up cadence at the end. And we'll just choose an acceleration rate of 7 here. And if you look at the timeline, you can see by the spacing between these cues that we're starting out at a leisurely pace and then it's building to a climax. Now I'll just move this right up in front of the salute. So here's our show. Let's take a look. Okay, I'm not going to enter this one into the choreography contest, but it's good for this example on racking. So specifically, we're worried about racking chains here. And the first example was the concern about chains spilling off of the end of racks. The reason that I chose to create a chain of 6 was that I knew that my 3-inch racks had 10 tubes in them, and I knew that 6 wasn't going to fit very well into 10. So having defined the show like this, I'll do add racks for show. It's picking racks out of the generic effects here. It looks like the shells that I inserted were 2-inch. I meant to put in 3-inch, but it doesn't matter too much. Okay, so it added these racks. Here are the racks for my salutes. Here are the racks for my shells. When I address the show, it fills the pin numbers into the tubes. Okay, so this is kind of what we'd expect, but I'd like to point out something. Since the number 6 does not divide evenly into the number 10, the first chain of 6 shells occupies the first 6 tubes of this rack, and then the second chain picks up after that, occupying the remaining 4, but then spilling over into the last one. So we might want to do that depending on our setup policies, but we might also want to not do that. So when addressing the show, I'm going to add a constraint. See how useful these constraints are? See how many times in the addressing we've dealt with them? Now I'm going to address the constraint that each pin is restricted to a single rack. Why am I doing that? Well, the chain, all of the shells of the chain are on the same pin. So if I restrict a pin address to the same rack, then that chain cannot be shared across multiple racks. And take a look. So much cleaner. Now I've got one chain in each one of these and no chain spilling over the end. But as I look down at my modules here, I'm seeing something in red, which is a warning to me that I'm not done. I've got work to do. Why? Well, I'll hold my cursor over it and it says, look, this is a chain of 6 shells, and it's showing me 6 warning messages because there are actually 6 shells that are unracked. Now I could edit pins and rack this manually. I'm doing that 6 times because I had to get rid of the, all 6 shells. So I could do that manually, but that's really sort of defeating the purpose. What I wanted to do was have one chain in each one of the racks, and that's what it did. So I'm pressing undo to undo that change. But I've got to get rid of the red. Well, when I made the decision that I wanted to restrict chains to single racks to avoid spilling over the end of a rack, now I need more racks because I'm not able to use these extra tubes given the constraints that I've laid out. So I'm going to move these racks over a little bit and add, how many do I need? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I need to add 6 more. Put them all together. Readdress the show. Okay, and now there's no red down here because all of my chains fit. Now the reason I was earlier planning on using 3-inch shells instead of chains is that it makes the problem a little bit more complex in that in my ideal layout, I would like the chains to be laid out exactly as they are, but if these were 3-inch shells instead of 2-inch shells, I'd like them to fill in the gaps. And I want to make sure that the chains get kind of first dibs to fill out from the tops of the racks. And I can guarantee that when addressing the show by choosing an order of assignment that says chains first, and then event time. So now the chains are going to be assigned first, which guarantees they're going to get first dibs at the racks, and then the remaining tubes will fill out with the individual shells. So that's the second real world example. We've got one more and then we're all done. Cross-loading chains. In the cross-loading chains case, usually the scenario is that I have chains in a fan. So let's take a look at these chains here. And I'm going to put them all in fans. Make flights or chains into fans. So this is going to take each chain and put it into a fan. And I'll make the angle interval 15 degrees. I'll move it back now. Here's our show leading up to finale at the end. So when I add racks for show this time, I just did add racks for show, and I got a message saying, I don't see any compatible racks. And the reason I got this message is in the effects window, I was looking at My Effects, and My Effects didn't have any racks in it other than maybe that one rack that we made. So it didn't have the racks that were compatible with the effects in my show. I want to switch back to the generic effects in this demonstration so I can use the default racks that are predefined. Having done that, going back to generic effects up here, I do add racks for show, and that's good. I get 12 3-inch racks, 2 2-inch racks. Let's take a look at what they look like. And readdress the show. Oh, you know what? Well, why is it all red? Well, it's all red because I still have this restriction that a pin is restricted to a single rack. Well, that's not going to work at all right now because the pin specifically is, it cannot be restricted to a single rack because I'm cross-loading the chains across multiple racks. So remove that. In other words, the chains this time are going to go sideways instead of up and down in respect to the rack layout. I'm expecting this to work. It does. Good. Okay. So you can see as it laid out the racks here, the angles are at the top of the racks. So it's actually in two groups here. This is kind of 37 degrees to the left. This is 37, 38 to the right. There are actually two groups of racks and fans. So I'm going to move them into two groups. Okay, so when I address the show into those two groups, these are cross-loaded chains. You can see number one is cross-loading across all of those chains in a fan. When I address into it, I'm seeing no problems here. That's great. But if I wanted to make sure, I could go back and address the show with the constraint that a pin is restricted to a single rack cluster. And remember, a rack cluster is a group of racks snapped together. So that means that a pin, which in this case is a chain, is restricted to a rack cluster, the left or the right. It'll work right now. But if I did something like split that rack off from the cluster to be by itself and then address the show, then I would get problems. So you can see that that restriction of the pin to a rack cluster is guaranteeing that my cross-loaded chains are cross-loading into the clusters that I've set up for them. All right. Terrific. So that's all of the real world examples that we're going to talk through in detail. I want to mention a couple of advanced topics. I introduced pre-wired racks to you. I'm going to talk for one moment about rack type, pre-configured rack angles, variable tube sizes like the Pyrolamus racks, racks that are in circles. And finally, a topic here, why is type so important? So all of these that have links, I'm not going to talk about it all because there's really good documentation on the website for this in the addressing and racking sections. So when you get to this stage of doing racking and dealing with these more complex things, please go to the documentation. I do want to mention the two that do not have links right now, because they're good concepts for you to take away with you today. Why is type so important? And what is rack type? You see this column up here in the script, type, on the right? Well, that type has only a few possibilities. It can be cake, comet, shell, single shot. And that type controls various parameters or configurations for the software that depend on what type of effect it is. For example, if the type of the item is single shot, then it will go into a single shot rack. And if the type is not single shot, it won't go into a single shot rack. And that's because, well, if it's a single shot, it has its own tube. And if it's not a single shot, then it needs to go into a mortar if it's a shell or a mine or a comet. So the type is not just a field for you to search by. It actually has meaning. It actually is important. So when you're racking your show, if your effects are single shots and they're going to go into single shot racks, then their type needs to be single shot. Single shot. I switched to my effects here. So there's cake. I could change that to single shot, or change it to shell, etc. These types here in this column on the far right matter for racking, and they also matter for other things. So there's an important article on the website in the addressing section. I think I won't go to it now, but there's in the addressing section, or if you search for it on the website, there's an important article called "Why is Type So Important?" And the article explains all of the things that this parameter affects. It affects whether mortars are required, whether it fits into a single shot or a non-single shot rack. It affects whether the duration is adjustable, as it is adjustable for special effects like flame maybe, but not for pyro effects, and various other things. So that's an important one. One final thing in the advanced topics to mention is rack type. Rack type is a different field. I can unhide the rack type field. Here it is, rack type default. So type is one field and rack type is a different field. The rack type field is unlike rack type, unlike type, which is a fixed number of possibilities that have special meaning. Rack type is a field that you can put a label there of anything that you want, and it doesn't have any special meaning to the software. All it does is allow you to specify a matching criterion defining what effects go into what types of racks. If you have, for example, a fan rack, and you have a fan of shots in the show, and you want those shots to go into that fan rack, then you can assign the rack type, you can make up the name, you could call it fan. And you can give your fan rack the rack type fan, and you can give the effects that are supposed to go into that rack, the rack type fan. And then when the addressing algorithm comes along and assigns racked tubes to the effects, it notices the effects have a rack type of fan, and it says that it can only look for a rack that has a matching name. So it's a way that you can control what racks get used for what effects. There's more description of that in the addressing and the racking documentation on the site. That's it for the advanced topics, and that's actually it for racking. So we're going to take, I'm going to take 1 or 2 minutes to answer questions, and then I'll finish up with a short presentation on customizing reports. So Drew, you want to be the master of ceremonies here for answering questions?
Yep, absolutely. I will. We do have a few questions here. For example, a user, an attendee asks, what about ranges of calibers? The question is, if you have different size single shots that go into a rack, how would you accomplish that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I was just talking about rack type. So you can use rack type to represent a range of calibers. So you can make a rack type called small and another rack type called medium. And to you, maybe rack type small means 1.5 inches and less, and rack type medium means 2 inch to 2.5 inch or something. And then you can use the rack type of small or medium to control what sizes of effects in a range go into what effects, into what racks. So that's an answer to the specific question of how do you do it. I will say though that I've gotten that question enough times that as a programmer I'm thinking, you know, enough people have asked for size range that maybe we should add size range as a special field instead of having to use rack type to accomplish it. So we may do that in the polishing phase of the roadmap.
Great. Let's see what else we got. Question, can we have the ability within blueprints to address shells in ascending order, lowest to highest using chain quantity, to enable the user to address single shells first and then chains last within a position?
Well, that's interesting. Usually that's the opposite of usually what I get asked. Usually you want to address the longer chains first. Let me take a look to see if we can do it in the reverse order there. So the answer is yes. Flight length, I think, is the parameter. I'm sharing my screen, so I'll switch back to the application and look at what the options are. Address show. Let me take a look. Longest flights first. I think the person asking this question knew what he was asking and he trapped me because I see longest flights here and I don't see shortest flights here. So I'll tell you what, if you could just send me an email explaining why you'd want to do shortest flights first, I have no objection to adding that as another option.
All right. Trying to parse through some of the questions that we can take. I do want to let everybody know that we do have a record of all the questions, and so we'll be able to, of course, reach out to us if you don't get an answer, but we can follow up with some of these offline as well, the ones that are difficult to take during the conference. Other question here, can you mark an error as not an error to differentiate it from real errors? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Yeah, I think I understand that. I was mentioning before that things can turn red and that you can view red as a warning. But when you assign firing system addresses, the most common circumstance under which this occurs is for cakes, where people commonly don't want to assign racks for their cakes because they don't use cake racks and it's just a degree of complexity they don't care about. And yet the software is expecting, if you're using racks, that everything gets a rack. So in the addressing algorithm, it reports all of the missing cake racks as errors. So in that specific case, we're going to add an option in the polishing phase to ignore cakes, so that you have the option to ignore all of those errors. If there are other errors that you would like to ignore, I'd like to hear about that actually, because that may be something that we should address as well. Where, in other words, our answer to your question is like specific to that circumstance, and you may have other things in mind. So if you don't mind, send us an email with an explanation, and we'll take it. We'll take the feedback. Drew, let me suggest that at this point we move on from the questions and move forward into the next presentation.
Yeah, I'd like to just take one here myself really quickly. This is directly related to the discount that we're offering, the promotion, the PTC 2020 code. An attendee asks, what does lifetime mean? Lifetime means that since Finale 3D is an annual subscription, using that coupon code when you purchase Finale 3D for the first time will ensure that you get that price each year when Finale 3D is renewed and your license is renewed. So for as long as you maintain the subscription, you get that discount using that code. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. And Will, go ahead and take it away.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for for sticking with it all the way to the end. We're nearing the end of the conference now, and I want to take just a couple of minutes to do custom reports since we promised it to you. And it's not going to be too long. We'll run probably 10 minutes over. So if you can stick around for 15 minutes, we've got this last section for you. Then we'll take a couple of questions and we'll wrap up. This last section is on custom reports. I'm going to give you an overview, then we'll work through an example, and then I'll just mention the upcoming features to the reports, because reports are going to get a whole lot more powerful coming up. So in the overview, first I'll just show you a picture. Here's a standard report on the left, the script, and here's a standard set of labels on the right. So if you're using the software and you just print a report and choose script, you're going to get something that looks somewhat like that. And if you print any of the labels options, you're going to get something that looks like this. So when I talk about custom reports, what I mean is beginning with something like, one of the standard reports, or starting from scratch, but usually it's easier to begin with something instead of a blank page. Let's transform it into something else. So the thing on the left is a script. The thing on the right is a completely different report that is telling me for each position, and it has one page for each position, how many single shot effects, how many separate devices do I have at each angle? And maybe if I was going to build my own racks, this might be useful information for me. So I'm picking this example of the before and after because these reports really don't look much like each other at all. So in making the transformation from one to the other, we're going to get to exercise the customization features that you'll be able to use for whatever your purposes are. Okay, so here's what we're doing. We're going to create that example report that has, for each position, we want to see the count of the single shots at each angle. I'm going to, just like in the previous examples, I'm going to need a little show to do this. So let me switch back to the software. And I have a show already built to save us some time. Here it is. Okay, so this show contains over here just some shells, all right, of various calibers. And then over here, these are the single shots. And it's just several volleys of single shots. I'll zoom in a little bit. Each volley of single shots has 4 single shots with 4 different angles, okay? And we have 3 positions. So I'd like to print a report that tells me how many single shots I have in position 1 at this angle, and this angle, and this angle, and this angle, and I really want to just ignore all of these shells. So here's how we go about doing that. When you print out a report, the report is based on a data set, which is a set of rows that comes from one of these windows. It comes from either the effects window up here or the script window here, or it can come from the racks list down here. Most commonly, it comes from the script because the script has a row for every effect in the show, and usually the reports, the most common reports that people make are reports that are kind of beginning with that set of rows and then coalescing them into a different set of information or format. The script example is a basic example where we're basically showing one row in the script for one row in the script data set. But the example that we're doing now is different, where we begin with lots of rows. How many rows do we have? 57 rows. And then the report, though, is going to be a table that has far fewer than 57 rows because it's not going to have one row per effect. It's going to have one row per angle per position. And it'll basically count the number of rows in the script at each one of those angles. Okay, so to create a custom report, first of all, I'm going to just print a report so you can see how that's done. Report, to print a script, basic report, give it a name, script 10, and there it came up. So this report looks basically like what you saw in the on the slide. Now I'm going to customize this report. When I customize it, the way that I do it is I change the table layout of the window that contains the data set for the report to be the same as what I want actually in the report. That's a mouthful of words. Here's what I mean. The end result here doesn't need to have the event time in it. So I'm going to hide the event time. Doesn't need to have the pre-fire, so I'm going to hide that. Doesn't have the effect time, hide that. Doesn't have the part number, hide that. Doesn't have the size, hide that. Doesn't have the description, hide that. Doesn't have, I'm going to start out with the position, and I'm going to keep the tilt, hide this, hide the rail, hide the pin, hide the chain, hide the notes, hide the angle, and add the devices count. There we go. So this is like a preview of the report. So I'll now go to the blue gear menu and save current table layout. The current table layout is what I'm looking at here. So save current table layout to report template, and I'm going to make a new report up here. That's another mouthful of words. See if you can remember those menu items. Okay, so this table layout is defining what the report is supposed to look like. There's some additional information which is being asked here. What do I want to name it? I'm going to call it the angle count 2. And I'm going to call it up here angle counts per position. Instead of every row in the script becoming a row in the report, I'm going to sort the row first by position and then by angle or tilt. And then I'm going to combine all the rows together that have the same position and the same angle or tilt. Okay, so what's going on here is, if you imagine that script, I'm sorting it first by position and then breaking ties by angle. And then whenever there are two rows that have, in a row, that have the same position and angle, it's combining or coalescing those two rows into one. And when it does so, the devices count will sum the devices count of the combined rows. So if I have 7 rows that are being combined, then the devices count in the combined row will be the number 7. Angle count 2, here it is. Okay, let's print this out. Reports. Here it is, angle counts per position is what I called it. Okay, it's a good start. So we began with the script here, which had like 57 rows, I think. You know, multiple pages. And now we just have a total of 15 rows, and we're getting closer to what we wanted, where for position 1, the first 5 rows are position 1, and it's showing the 5 angles at position 1, and it's showing the number of devices at each one of those angles. So it's a little bit messed up at this point because we haven't yet excluded these shells, so I'll do that next. And I will also now split it up so that each one of these positions goes onto a separate page. So I'm going to go back to the blue gear menu, edit report template. Angle counts 2 is here. And I think I wanted to add a page break when the position changes. I'm also going to include the position in the title of each page. And I meant to filter out the effects that are not single shot so that this report just deals with the single shot. So I can type in the filter here, type equals single shot. That'll exclude these others. And let's take a look at that. All right, this is looking promising. I have 3 pages here. This is page 1. Scroll down to page 2. Scroll down to page 3. Each page has one position because we put the page breaks in after the positions. And the page has a title here telling me what the position is. So this is basically the report that I want. So I'm down to the nitty-gritty now. I'm just trying to make it look good. Since I have the title of the position now on the page, I can remove the position column. And also, just to make the page more readable, I'm going to expand the size of the font and of the spacing around the font, the padding. So go back to edit report template, angle counts 2. I was going to expand the font size, change that from 10 to 14, expand the padding to 0.5. And I was going to remove the position column. So lastly, I'll hide the position column here. And save the current table layout onto my report template, having hidden the position column. Okay. Print this diagram or this report. There we go. The rows are all now bigger. Actually, maybe I wanted to, maybe I could have removed this line number row as well to gussy it up. But the rows are bigger, it's showing just the information I wanted, and beginning with the data set from the script, we're able to create a table that coalesces the information into the format that I want to read. So that's the basics of how to create custom reports. The filters we use there are, the features we use there are a filter. We combined rows to basically count rows in this scenario, and then we change some of the formatting. So I want to show one more thing. Upcoming features. Everything about reports is customizable. The features that we're adding are also going to be customizable, but they build on top of the customizable features that we already have. We will add subtotals and tallies. We'll add column formatting options, the ability to rename columns. We're going to add more to labels for people who want to make module tags. And finally, we're adding a feature called books, which combines reports together into a combination of reports that we call a book. This is the final step in our grand plan for these report customizability, because the combination of reports will allow you to begin with defining every individual piece of information that you want, each table of information that you want, and then combine them all together with tallies and subtotals, so that having made that definition, you're then able to just press one button and get the entire list of reports that you need for shooting a show. Terrific. We covered this kind of quickly, but this is the introduction to report customization. I hope this gives you a sense for what's possible and where we're going. Drew, that's all I have. Let me switch back to you.
All right, perfect. Well, let's stay on the line here. Will, do you want to take a couple questions, or how shall we proceed? I don't have any specific plan for the very end here, except a big thank you to everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. We still see there's hundreds of people online, which is amazing for something that ran several hours. So we really appreciate you being here with us. And Will, what do you say? Take a few questions, or how should we go?
Yeah, I'll take 2 or 3 questions, pretty short, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody.
Okay, perfect. Let's see here. I had a couple that I thought were. Here's a good question. How do you tell Finale how many racks you physically own? Can you do this now, or could it be done with Finale inventory?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is sort of no and no. You currently can't tell Finale 3D how many racks you own, and it currently doesn't have a warning when you exceed the number of racks that you own. But people have asked for this, and I think it's a great idea. It's actually related also to, analogously, how many modules do you own? So what we're going to do is add some information in an information panel on the design window that shows you how many modules and how many racks you're sort of requiring with the show as you're designing the show, so that you can keep track and look at that number and compare it to the number of racks that you have available. Finale inventory doesn't really have a facility for equipment rentals, which is kind of how you think of racks from an operational perspective. So it's not an area that we handle particularly well yet.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Will. I got one comment in here I just want to react to. It says, remind everybody about the shirts. So for any reason you weren't here at the beginning of yesterday, the beginning of today, we are creating a custom t-shirt as a free handout to all the attendees. Sign your name on a sheet of paper, a white sheet of paper, take a photo of that with your phone and email that to us. Email address is will@finale3d.com, and we'll incorporate that into a custom t-shirt. So thanks for that. There's a lot of people saying thank you, and we appreciate that. We put a lot of work into the event, and so we're really excited that you got so much out of it, or at least the folks that that commented here. So we really appreciate the thanks. Means a lot to us. One other question, Will, we'll wrap up with this one. Can you give us a racking specific roadmap overview? It's a great set of features, but not as quick and easy to work with as the scripting part of Finale 3D, what's planned. Now, I don't think that's something we can do right now, but definitely maybe something we can put together in terms of the timeline for improving racks, and maybe you can touch on it just a little bit.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let me answer that question sort of by saying what the goal is. The goal is so that it is easy to use and understandable, and it isn't right now. And we understand that. We don't know, to be honest with you, all of the features that we have to add and things that we have to fix to make it more easy and understandable. So we don't know specifically what the roadmap is, but we know what the goal is. And we're pretty confident that it is achievable, and we're quite confident that the foundation of what we've built is going to get there, that we're not going to have to change anything, because we built up from having a very expressive and powerful system, and the task now from where we stand to the future is making it more understandable.
All right, excellent. Well, again, we appreciate everyone being here, and it was an absolute pleasure hosting this event. On behalf of myself and Will Harvey, our CEO, and Dustin Leary, our principal software engineer, we really appreciate it, and we hope to hear from you all very soon. Anything else, Will, to add?
No, thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, it's bittersweet to say goodbye, but it's been a pleasure, and we will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.